So will you tell me a little bit about your career as a pianist?
Let's see, I started playing when I was about 8, and I was very lucky. I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, not exactly the cultural capital of the world, but there's a very strong music department at Texas Tech University.
Okay.
So I started just studying privately, and by the time I was about 14, I believe I started taking from a professor at Texas Tech, and then when I was 15, I started doing accompanying work in the music department. So I actually started working professionally as a pianist when I was 15. I was playing rehearsals for musicals and operas and voice lessons and recitals with instrumentalists, things like that. So that was sort of the very beginning how it started. And then I did my degrees, bachelor, master degrees in piano performance at the Pianist College of Music in New York, a conservatory that is now the classical division of the New School for Social Research. Actually, that's only transpired over the past few years.
Yeah.
And I ended up in Houston because I got a job as a staff pianist at the Shepherd School of Music. So I was a staff pianist there at Shepherd from '92 to 2001. And in the meantime, I was doing some cool things. I had a really wonderful Japanese violinist friend and did several tours in Japan with her, and then with a violinist here in Houston, did a recording of the Charles Ives sonatas that was released by Naxos, and just some cool things. But then I'd always been interested in music and social work. Even when I was a student, I was organizing benefit concerts for things when I was in New York. So then after that, for a few years, I was playing chamber music and subbing extra keyboard work with the Houston Symphony a lot. But then I embarked on the idea of music and social work and philanthropy. So I did a lot of volunteer work with Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston, and did work with refugees. I was a language tutor, but also did some art projects that benefited the refugees, and recorded a CD project that was sort of educational about refugee issues, as well as raising money and awareness for them. And then for a few years, I directed a program called Mukuru through AIDS Foundation Houston, which was a chamber music and art series that raised money for HIV prevention programs. And then in the past few years, now I work for an organization called Music Doing Good, where I direct a scholarship program. So I still actively perform in chamber music concerts in town, and a variety of different things, and some through Music Doing Good. Then I direct the scholarship program there, and then in the middle of all that, started studying Jung. So then my interest in music and psychology has also dovetailed. So I've done quite a few concerts and things that were specifically tailored to be programs here at the Jung Center in Houston.
Cool. And so how's your knowledge of psychology, I guess, affected you as a performer?
Let's see. In a way, it's kind of worked the other way around, because I've been a musician for so long. Studying psychology later in life, I'm kind of applying all the things that I learned about myself as a performer than to psychology. Because studying an instrument and both the discipline required, as well as the ability to then let go and be inspired and perform, the constant juggling of what are conscious forces and what are unconscious forces is a balance that all performers, to a certain extent, always have to address, and they have to address it in a conscious way. It's like if I'm too conscious about this, then the really inspired, good stuff is not going to come out. If I'm completely unconscious and things have no structure, have no discipline, then things can just be an emotional mess. So I think I would say more that I've learned more about psychology, and that's why Jung's approach to the conscious and the unconscious makes so much sense to me, is really because of my experiences as a musician. So it sort of worked the other way around. But they definitely relate to one another.
Okay. And have you experimented, I guess, with both sides of it, where you play very consciously and very unconsciously and see how it turns out?
A bit. You know, I've done a fair amount of recording, and when you're recording, you have the luxury of trying something and then going back, and you can, you know, really experiment with both ends of the spectrum if you're really, really conscious about certain things, or if you just kind of let things go. And inevitably, it's usually the balance of the two that really finds the best. Of course, when you're performing live, you know, you're at the mercy of what happened to you that day, and I think you learned that complete control is certainly an illusion, that, you know, that we control certain things, but that the real beauty of a performance happens in the letting go and the allowing for these wonderful inspirations to come through. But of course, that's a delicate balance, because you have to be prepared and ready and, you know, on top of everything in order for those things to happen. So I would say that what I learned from the musical approach is just the constant balance of those two poles of relating to the music and thinking and not thinking. It's just a constantly responding and being in the moment and balancing as you go.
How would you conceptualize your music in terms of how much of yourself you're putting into it at any given moment?
I think clearly when we read a book, when we talk to another human being, when we do anything, whether we're conscious of it or not, everything is going through the lens of our perception. And that's what so much of depth psychology and psychoanalysis says, is that we may think we're being objective in the way that we perceive things, the way we relate to someone, or the way we interpret a piece of music, but clearly all of our history, all of our past, all of our unconscious forces are coloring and are shaping those ways. So I think that, again, that's a balancing point, and that the more aware I am of the way I feel about the music, of my own prejudices, of my own shortcomings, and balancing that with what is the music itself saying. And that's another important part, is to flip that around, because so often, whether it's approaching music or approaching anything, I'm just bringing my whole ideas and belief system and self completely to the table. And it's like, what do I think about this piece of music? But it's the openness to flip things around. It's like, what is this music asking of me? You know, in this Chopin nocturne, you know, what was Chopin experiencing? What is he trying to express? And ultimately, something will emerge that is neither purely Chopin or purely Rodney Waters or the Pianist or anything. It's something else. And to me, that has a lot to do with when Jung talks about the transcendent function, which is so much a core of his idea of the individuation process. You know, that we have these two very different things, opposites oftentimes. And if one is polarized in one side or another, there is no growth. But when the two really, really come together, then a third new thing emerges. And that's in a way the way I see performing and interpreting, is that you really have to be open for something new to emerge. You're not just saying, this is what I think about this, but also saying, what is this art form? What is this piece of music? What is this composer asking of me, and challenging the way I think about it. And also the allowance of that evolution. And you may plan to interpret something a particular way, and then it comes out differently, sometimes better, sometimes not as good. And then if you play a piece several years down the road, something is very different. Your perspective has changed. You know, but I think it is always extremely crucial to try to think also from the inside out of the piece or the work of art or something else. Say, what is that asking of me?
And to what extent is the music playing you in a way?
Exactly.
So do you see yourself as, I guess, a conduit of the music that you play?
I would break that down a little bit more. I would see myself more as an interpreter of that musical piece, but hopefully a conduit of the inspiration of music itself, which is a larger, more archetypal, more spiritual kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, because I can play a very accurate, well done interpretation of a particular thing, but if I'm not open to a deeper level of inspiration, if I'm just trying to get it right, or trying to impress people, or trying to do something more from an ego center and more from a control center, then I'm missing the actual music. And to me, that kind of inspiration is something that does feel more like a conduit, because that cannot be controlled. You know, like a spiritual reality, or like something much larger and more archetypal. One can just be open to those sorts of things. You know, so I would say, you know, it's a little bit of both, but the inspiration of music itself is different from the interpretation of a specific piece.
Okay. And so in a way, I guess, with the unpredictable aspect, it's impacted in a large way by the audience and by how people respond emotionally to what you're playing.
Oh, sure. People often don't realize we live in an age where people are used to sitting in front of a movie screen or a television or a computer screen, and the actual act of live performance has so much to do with what is going on in the room and what is happening with the audience, because that is so palpable. You know, you really feel all that, and that's why often my very, very favorite performance situations are like house concerts, you know, groups where, you know, people are sort of gathered around and it's a very small group and you really feel all the energy, you know. So it's definitely that the outcome, the sum is greater than all the parts of the individual, and what the audience brings to the experience in an emotional and spiritual and energetic way is all determines the outcome of what happens for their own experience as well as for the performer.
So you compose music as well. As you're performing, do you feel elements of the creative process and the composition process come into play?
A bit. I mean, I do some composition and I improvise quite a bit. I would never really call myself a composer, one really dedicated to that craft. But I do know what it's like to create from that side of things. And I think, again, part of that is the responsibility to look at where the artwork has come from. You know, when you think about, no matter what kind of music, no matter what the form of art, all these creative artists started with a blank page or, an empty canvas. And we think of, a Beethoven sonata or a piece that we know or a Beatles song, and it seems inevitable. It's like, of course that's what it is. But we have to realize that they struggled and sweat and really wrestled with that piece to become what that piece really is. And so, when you see a decrescendo or very, very small markings or an accent here or something there, we also have to realize that they probably struggled and sweat over exactly how to bring their inspiration into the clearest notation. So all that must be taken very, very seriously from the interpreter, the performer's perspective, with an understanding of what the composer was coming from. So I think, if anything, it does make me very sensitive to what they were going through in terms of their own personal creative process.
And does it change meaning for you over time as you go through one song and play it over the years? Sure.
I think the meaning for the song changes. I change, so my perspective on it changes. Experience with a piece also changes so much because you can let go into the unconscious much more. You know, when it still is the same for me as it was when I was young. When you perform a piece of music for the first time, it's, you know, a lot of you is trying to just accomplish the performing of it. You know, at least from in my experience, that's what it is. You know, when you've played a piece over a few years or you come back to it, then you can dedicate more of yourself to just being in the piece. You're less worried about, you know, the motor memory, the muscle thing is sort of into you a lot more. And so more of you can be open to different levels of the piece that you didn't encounter before, because more of your brain and yourself was, you know, worried about jumping down the octave to that B flat or whatever is going on.
Yeah.
So that's part of it, which I think, you know, in psychological terms would be the conscious things become a sort of more of motor memory, that's more operating on its own, so that one can be really, really open more to whatever is going on in your own unconscious, and whatever in one's own unconscious is triggered by this, you know, giant archetype, which is music or the art itself.
Do you ever feel like you have unconscious slips as you're going through songs that you've played for a while? Like, much like the unconscious kind of seeps without our knowing into daily life, do you feel that way during songs as well, where maybe you might play a different note by accident or make slips?
Right, and you know, sometimes those spontaneous things and those slips, if they come out of a place of being fully present, and one is really open, sometimes really, really beautiful things happen. Or especially, my favorite is chamber music. Mostly I perform chamber music these days. You know, or someone that you're playing with does something different or particularly beautifully, and then, of course, you have to respond to it differently because it's a conversation. And those sorts of things are wonderful. But then there's the kind of unconsciousness that's just being distracted. Or, you know, you do sort of go on automatic pilot, and then you just sort of screw something up because you're not quite there with it. So, you know, it's this constant, you know, almost Buddhist balance of trying to be fully present and open to what is happening in the moment.
So, how do you see love being played or being expressed in your own music?
Now, that's a tricky question. And I think there are lots of ways to approach it. First of all, one has to narrow down a little bit one's concept of love. You know, there's a lot of, you know, are we talking about romantic love? Are we talking about love in a larger sense? I thought maybe I would bring in a little bit of Jung here, since we are in the Jung Center. One of his favorite quotes that I love is, "Where love rules, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, there love is lacking. The one is a shadow of the other." So if love is not the will to power, then love is a kind of openness and surrender. So and this is more of an abstract term than, you know, how one feels about one's boyfriend or girlfriend when one plays a concert. You know, that's a different kind of thing. But in this sense, I would think that to love a piece of music and to love that particular performance clearly is not about controlling that performance. It's not the will to exert one's ego over that piece and prove it to everyone how good one is. But it's, again, the surrender to the experience and the inspiration that that piece can offer. And, you know, in that sense, I think, you know, that the love is a kind of surrender, you know, to the audience, to the beauty of what is going on, to the gratitude of that piece of music and the opportunity to share it, you know, in that way.
Do you think it catches on, that people can tell when you are loving your art openly and with great surrender?
I believe so. You know, and, you know, of course I'm not the best to judge myself, but I mean, certainly for me as an audience member, you know, if there's you know, often musicians that you hear, or that you know well, you know, or even musicians that you play with, sometimes that magical thing really, really happens, and there's just this real inspiration and this real openness, and that isn't achieved by force or will, or by the conscious ego. That's really a gift. So, that's the sort of mercurial nature of the muse and inspiration, and when it shows up.
And is it something that can be named necessarily, do you think?
It can be named as well as, I'm calling it inspiration here. It can be named as well as love can be named. I mean, we can talk about love a lot, but ultimately it's an experience that goes beyond language. We know if we are in a situation in which we feel loved, and we can then describe it afterwards, but that's pure experience. So, it's the kind of thing I think we can all recognize, when you go to a concert or when something special happens, when you hear a play or something in a book or a piece of artwork, when something then takes you beyond language and you just have an experience of, we can call it inspiration or openness or whatever, watching a sunset, hiking, something in nature, I think, it's the kind of thing that we all can relate to certain experiences that we've had, but to name them or really call them something in a way, it's describing them, but it's taking away from what that is. So it's the kind of thing that I think we all recognize, but maybe can't describe exactly.
So it involves a big sensation of being loved, even though it comes from something quite abstract.
I believe so. And everyone would have their own subjective criteria for what it means to feel loved, or like they're loving something. We can talk about acceptance. We can talk about, a release of boundaries and pretenses and a feeling of unity with things larger than yourself. And again, that's a very subjective thing. And you can be in a performance where some people love it and some people don't love it. So it's fascinating just to see how we respond and why we respond the way we do.
Do you think that in a way it's a loss of control and a loss of power in exchange for heightened awareness and heightened feeling?
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, I think it is.
Does it make you more aware, of where you are and your current state of being loved and those around you?
Yes, I believe it does. It really, again, it's the sort of conscious ego control, that often gets in the way of being open to these experiences. And I think that's why people, drugs, alcohol, certain kinds of addictions, I think, or on the positive side, hiking, going into nature, jumping out of an airplane, doing these things because it's a way of allowing us to have pure experience. To a certain extent, we know that all this head noise needs to get out of the way for us to have really genuine experience. So we find ways of doing that, and some bring us to a genuine experience, and some just numb us so that we don't have any experience at all.
How do you think one's personal love life can play into both the performative and the creative aspects of music?
Of course, that's huge, and certainly huge in the history of music. And one thing that is fascinating to me is to look at particular stories. So now might be a good time for me to talk about one of my favorite composers, Leos Janáček. And I did a performance of some of his music here at the Young Center last year. He's such a fascinating figure in music. Mostly active in the early 20th century. He died in 1928. But when he was younger, he was a very good composer and wrote some really wonderful pieces. Chamber music, piano pieces, choral pieces. He was a conductor, he was an organist. But if he had died at the age of 62, he would have been a very minor figure in 20th century music. But when he was 62 years old, he met a woman named Kamila Stoslova, who was 26 at the time. This was in 1917. And he became completely obsessed with her and infatuated. They were both married. Their families met on a vacation. And he began writing her letters. And for the next 11 years, he wrote her over 700 letters. And then started composing music for her. She literally became his muse. And she was young, she was uneducated. She wrote back sometimes, sort of entertained, probably thought he was kind of a crazy old man. And he began writing all these masterpieces for her. So the heroines in all of his later operas, Yennefer was earlier, so Katia Kabanova, the Macropolis Case, all these later operas, the two string quartets, Kreutzer Sonata and Intimate Letters, which directly refers to their relationship. He wrote the Sinfonietta later, he wrote the wind quintet called Youth. When he was about 70 years old, he's writing a piece called Youth. Because this complete obsession unlocked something in him, clearly. And in a way, the fact that it was not really a mutual relationship, probably not consummated, it was this distant thing, since it was all taking place within him, and music was his outlet, that became that expression. So even rather than often an expression between two people, she was the catalyst, but it was an expression between him and the music. And he even said he referred to the Intimate Letters String Quartet as basically as their love child, that their psychic lovemaking created this, this offspring that was this incredible string quartet. You know, and so for the last 11 years of his life, his output is unbelievable, and nothing like I know of, certainly in music history or, you know, in a lot of disciplines, that from the age of 62 to, I believe he died at 73, that's when the primary output was. And it was all inspired by this obsessive love, infatuation with this sort of distant woman who wasn't even sure she wanted to have that much to do with him. So, you know, there are lots of remarkable love stories in the history of music, but that's probably my favorite.
Do you think that it would have been a similar scenario in terms of his musical output if it had been a mutual relationship, if it had not been him desperately trying to reach her?
That's very difficult to say, but I would, you know, the romantic in me would like to say, no, probably not. You know, it was the idea of the unobtainable. You know, it was the idea that something had to be expressed, since it couldn't be expressed as literally as he wanted it to be, that all that energy had to come out some way. It needed some outlet. And so for him, it was a musical expression.
Do you think there's something appealing to large audiences about someone being very, very passionate, even if it's being distraught?
Oh, being distraught is probably the greatest source of artwork ever. I mean, of course, we love, you know, we love a good sad movie. You know, we love to, for other people to unlock those things that we struggle with ourselves. So much of art, so much of music is all this anguish that that the artists and creators themselves would have no other outlet for, probably. And that's the reason that people relate to it, is that people tap into their own anguish, their own sadness, their own, you know, look at the plots of operas, you know, look at Shakespeare, you know, this sense of tragedy that's playing out somehow taps into something very, very, it's comforting in a way to see other people struggling with things that, you know, we may struggle with in very different ways, but metaphorically we feel some sort of empathy and connection.
So he was expressing very private, very deep parts of himself, but at the same time expressing public feelings almost, expressing sentiments that the general public feel.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's so much of, that's what art is, you know, that you know, it's kind of like being a voyeur. You get to see someone else's, the result of someone else's beautiful marriage, or, you know, horribly ending torrid affair. You know, all of that is played out, you know, in, you know, the Mahler symphonies, and Strauss, and, you know, Beethoven, and the idea of the immortal beloved, and all these sorts of, Dante and Beatrice, you know, these inspirations that people love these stories because they belong to us. You know, Jung would say they are archetypal. They are part of the collective unconscious that is the bedrock of what we all share as humanity.
Do you think that Janáček could be his own archetype and appear again in another torrid love affair several centuries down the line?
Well, that sounds like a great Twilight Zone episode or something. You know, but I think, you know, that's a theme, sort of the unrequited love that theme will be played out, you know, as long as humans are being humans, I think. You know, so his story is constantly being played out. You know.
Yeah. And it seems like the base story may be the same, but it's going to change in nature because now there are more women in music, more people who are outwardly queer or fluid in sexuality, and like there are many more different forms of this type of expression that are now becoming more publicly acceptable.
Right. Yeah, right. So you know, in the past when composers, you know, if their inspiration, you know, did have something to do with the same-sex relationship or all, you know, I mean, you know, you think about all of these artists that now, you know, we can look back and, you know, talk about Gertrude Stein and Oscar Wilde and Copland and Samuel Barber and Menotti and just all these people. And see in their music, and you know, then you think about, you're absolutely right, that the restrictions of how one is allowed to talk about one's private life and how that influences one's art, you know, those are opening up so much and are changing. But in a way, there are two different things here also. So we can talk about that more in a much more open way. But when something, and I'm not here, I can't define art per se, that's such a subjective thing, but when something really is a piece of art, or when something is something that people have a strong reaction to, you can look back, and there's an aspect in which the personal narrative of the creator is a part of it, is inevitable, is enlightening, is important. And then there's another aspect of it in which it's completely unnecessary for my experience of it. You know, someone can, you know, I as a gay man can maybe have a different reaction to a Samuel Barber piece, thinking of, you know, what he was experiencing and what it was like to be in the closet and all these sorts of things. But people that don't relate to the personal biography at all also love Samuel Barber and have all these experiences. So I think the personal biography of the composer can be enlightening, but it can also be limiting, because if it's a true piece of art, then it in a way it doesn't belong to the composer anymore. And it can be inspiring to people that have nothing to do with it. You know, I mean, we all love going to to seeing a beautiful documentary or a great movie that's about people that our physical biographies and our lives don't relate to them at all, yet somewhere on a level they touch us. Their story touches us, or their music touches us, or their art touches us. And so that personal part is informative, and yet ultimately it's something deeper that says we can all be connected in various ways and experience things in our own subjective way and be moved by something that's totally separate from maybe even the way it was created in the first place.
And so it changes over time regardless of whether the composer intended it or not.
Sure, I think a lot of artists, that's something they really struggle with, because once you release a piece into the world, well, it's different for the performing arts. If you think of a painting, the painting is going to be the painting. People are going to look at it differently. People are going to interpret it differently. But if you're talking about a piece of music or a play that's performed, or so many things like that, what the interpreter brings to it can completely change the shade, the meaning, the way that a director stages an opera. All these sorts of things. I think a lot of creative people struggle with releasing those things into the world because, then to a certain extent they don't just belong to them anymore, and they are subject to other people's interpretations. And that's, like you would say, everything, there's a lot of beauty in that, and then there's a dark side of that too.
Do you think that some people will release their art for that purpose, for the purpose of other people adding to it, or taking it and interpreting it?
I think all across the board. I think people create art out of their own past, their own personality type, their own, these sorts of things. So you have composers that intentionally, John Cage, someone who's going intentionally toward aleatoric or chance music that intentionally gives up. It's like, I don't want to control any of that. I want to set up a playground, or other, just being in the musical realm, composers that are very, very, very specific about the way their music should be interpreted, and very, very tight. So, it's across the whole gamut, and that's the beauty of the range of expression and just the range of human beings.
So love is often described as something that is ineffable. It can't, you can't quite put your finger on what it is. And do you think that a lot of times people will put things out there so that they, like, others can kind of find what that is, put their finger on it, and put their finger on something that they weren't able to describe verbally?
Definitely. I think so. But often I think with the most powerful artists, their intention isn't necessarily to do something for someone else. Their intention is merely to come to terms with whatever they need to express. That it's inevitable. There's the famous story, Leonard Bernstein's story, who taught for many years as a composer at Tanglewood, the famous summer camp. The famous story of a young composer coming to him and saying, these are my compositions, this is what I'm working on, I want to show them to you and ask you whether or not I should be a composer. And as the story goes, Bernstein just shoves the scores right back on the other side of the table and says, if you have to ask me whether or not you should be a composer, the answer is no. That these sorts of artistic things have to come out of an unavoidable impulse and need for expression. You know, today's Jung's birthday. You know, just think about, you know, for the Jungians in the audience, the Red Book, you know, was clearly his need to put some sort of tangible expression, and he resisted being called an artist, and it's a very different kind of thing. But that was necessary for him to live out his life, to be able to get that out in some sort of form. And I'd say it's, you know, no different for, you know, Beethoven or Mahler or Brahms or Frida Kahlo or anyone that you want to mention like that. That, you know, of course, public perception meant something, and all these sorts of outer things. But ultimately, it was the necessity of expressing whatever they were experiencing as a human being that calls one to put this stuff out into the world.
And I guess that's what drives it, even if the public doesn't approve of it right away.
Sure, you know, I mean, think of Van Gogh. I mean, you know, someone who got almost no recognition. No, I mean, Van Gogh is very extreme. No recognition during his lifetime. And look where we are now. But his necessity to create was not deterred by the lack of acknowledgement at that time. You know, and I think there are people that are influenced by that and are, you know, and are deterred by that. You know, but I know very creative people. A wonderful composer of mine who's had a lot of success. You know, and she would talk about, you know, when you're young and scrappy, you know, you'll take risks. You can do, you know, once you have a certain level of success then, and there are these expectations, it's like, do I know what I know is going to work? You know, or, you know, do I have the courage to try something new? You know, that's when public expectations can actually, and accolades and these sorts of things, can really muddy the waters of one's pure artistic expression. Because I think pure artistic expression is always wanting to take risks and move and evolve. And maintaining a level of success is a totally different subject.
Do you think that, so we know from the personal biographies of composers, kind of cause and effect events that kind of caused for a burst of creativity or a burst of inspiration, such as in the case of Janacek. But how can, I guess, semiotic undertones in music be interpreted and kind of be interpreted as the narrative of the artist when we don't have words or really explicit forms of representation to tell us these things?
Well, again, sort of a part of what I was saying before, the beauty of art is that we don't even necessarily, we don't need those, for a piece of music to open us up and for us to have one of those great experiences, we don't need to know the backstory. We don't need to know anything. Sometimes it can help, sometimes it can open up more, sometimes it can set the framework for our appreciation of all those sorts of things. But it's not necessary, you know. And that's one, I think, true test of a work of art is, you know, does someone receive something from it? Does it have an impact? Does it have a deep reaction and hopefully an opening, some sort of realization with or without the backstory?
So what happens when words are added to the picture, to the music?
Well, I think when words are added to anything, when you experience a really, really beautiful sunset, you can describe that sunset. I can describe my experience of that sunset. But all those things are different from the actual experience of the sunset. That is beyond language. The actual present experience of something very beautiful like that. And again, I think we can all think of times when that has happened. And we can go back and to describe it as one thing, describe the event itself, like to describe the music, to describe how we felt about it. You know, I felt like this when I listened to this performance of Janáček's Intimate Letters String Quartet. But the real experience itself, for me, if it's a real experience, then it is beyond narrative and beyond